price lies at the intersection of the supply and demand curves. It historically happens. Yeah, I would just say something like, one question we get asked all the time is, when are housing prices going to fall? When's the market going to crash? Are we in a housing bubble? And it's interesting to analyze that question and see how you're going to answer that. And, historically, we've lived through one housing crash, one boom and bust. There have been several throughout history, going back to the 1920s. It was the first real, documented housing boom and bust in this country. One in the 80s, but the one that's fresh on everyone's minds is the one that we went through in 2008. And I wonder, how much is there that we see today that mirrors what was going on in 2008? Or are we looking at two totally different things? And is there even a crash on the horizon?
Yeah, those are great questions. So maybe we should talk a little bit about what was going on in 2008, right? Just throw out some facts and some knowledge, some experience from what that was like back then, because we both lived it, right? And one thing that to me just resonates, comes right off the top of my mind, is the liar loan, right? Is that people would buy a house and they would use their credit and documented income, but then all of a sudden, the next month, our mortgage lender released this product where he was like, you don't have to verify anything. They won't verify any income, so we can write down that you make $1 million a year, and you'll qualify to buy this loan. And, of course, we're ethical people, so we're like, we're not going to do that. But a lot of people were doing that, and they were buying homes by saying they made $1 million, and they had to put nothing down. They were literally 100% financing loans. And because they said they made $1 million a year, well, they could more than adequately cover the cost of that loan, and they bought a house. Yeah. And they did that over and over. I think you could have 6 of those. There was something like that, if I'm not wrong.
Oh, yeah. In fact, I read an article recently that was likening that time period in mortgage lending to Columbus discovering the New World. And I believe he came over on the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, where it's 3 ships. Uh-huh. And so you had the Nina loan, the no income, no asset loan, the CISA loan, which was stated income, stated asset loan. And then they threw in negative AM. And that doesn't sound like Santa Maria. But, a lot of people are probably drinking something, similar to a Santa Maria when they agreed to take on those obligations.
That's perfect. Yes, I totally forgot.
You could literally walk into a bank, and if you had, I believe it was a 680 credit score, which is at the top of average. Right. You could walk in there and tell the lender, oh, I make $1 million a year. Right. Yeah, I own 20 rental properties worth $7 million. They'd be like, oh, great, this is perfect, man. You're going to be easily approved. Let's rubber stamp this and get you a quadplex.
That's right. So that was going on there. We had a reality where, you had, your barber, the server at the local restaurant. You sit down and you'd say, I'm in real estate. And they're like, yeah, I just bought an investment property. And they would talk about how they bought it with these kinds of loans. And they were going to flip it, right? Everyone was going to buy an investment property and flip it, right? And I don't know who they were going to flip it to, but there was always a buyer. And for a while, there was always a buyer. And you would watch these people successfully flip homes and clear $100,000 on flips that they just tied up for a short amount of time. And that was going on all the time.
It was like the gig economy before the gig economy existed, because literally everyone had a side hustle flipping houses.
Right.
And it wasn't even flipping houses. They never even saw these homes sometimes. Most of the time, I don't think they ever saw the homes. They just did it on paper. Right. They signed a contract, they put down a couple $1,000s deposit, and before they actually had to take out a loan and buy the house, they had flipped the contract to someone else for $30,000, $50,000, $100,000 profit. It was an amazing time, amazing opportunity for people that really knew nothing about what they were doing to make substantial amounts of money in this kind of speculation.
Right, and there was 2 other things that were kind of emblematic of this market. No one was living in these homes. It wasn't like they were ever selling it to an owner-occupant. It was always going to be sold to an investor, right? And so they stayed vacant. And they were buying these homes all over the country. It was everywhere. And it was always new product. Generally speaking, it was brand new product they were buying this way. And that's because builders were had built to beat the band, and there was tons and tons of inventory. Everywhere you drove around our area, at least, New home communities were going up. Tract built homes by all the big builders going up everywhere, and there was quality issues. There was all kinds of other things that would make these questionable, in terms of their, real quality. But they were being built everywhere, bought everywhere, flipped everywhere, and it was a frenzy.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting that it was on primarily new product. There was an explosion of growth at that time, especially here in the South. We had new construction going on everywhere. Here in Tampa Bay, it's like every time you turned around, there was a new neighborhood going in somewhere. And all that started in the early 2000s on the heels of the dot-com bust. It's like it slowly gained momentum, and then by 2004, 5, 6, it was full speed ahead. And these builders were throwing up homes right and left. They put in a couple hundred houses over the course of a 12-month period. And that just gave all of these speculators an opportunity to engage in this kind of, profit-making.
Yeah, so are we missing anything? Anything else really unique about that time or that was going on there that we need to remind the listeners about? Because that feels to me like the key points that really made that housing market special, right? Special in lots of ways. And it happened until all of a sudden it wasn't happening. I remember we had some clients had some houses. They were on the market for sale at these really high prices. I mean, prices had gone up, double, almost 1.5 times between the start of the decade and then 2006. But somewhere around June 2006, I remember homes just not selling as fast. And it wasn't like overnight the prices began to plummet, but homes weren't selling. It was like second quarter 2006. And then third quarter 2006, they still weren't selling, right? And then fourth quarter, it was like they started to soften a bit. Prices started to fall a little bit. And then by the time we got into the first quarter of 2007, the second quarter of 2007, prices were coming down kind of fast.
Yeah. There was a lot of people getting, left out to dry with these paper flips they were doing, and they had no means by which to actually close on these properties. And that was the beginning of abandonment, right? I mean, you remember, so this is interesting because obviously this is revisionist history in some ways because none of us saw this coming in 2004, 5, 6, 7. No one predicted it except for that one genius on The Big Short. I think he's the only guy that knew this was actually going to happen. But another guy that saw this coming, ironically, was a friend of mine who owns a nursery business, who was supplying landscaping for these new builder communities all over the Tampa Bay area. And he was showing up to these houses, putting trees and shrubbery in and mulch and laying sod. And he'd come back week after week after week and notice that all the sold homes were vacant. He's like, when are they going to move in? Oh, wait, they're not moving in. 6 months later, half the neighborhood's vacant. A year later, half the neighborhood's vacant. Like, what is going on here? It's as if people were flipping stock certificates or commodities or something like that. They were just doing it in the form of a brick and mortar home sitting on a lot, kind of starting to deteriorate for lack of use.
Yeah, that's right. They were deteriorating. And so we had abandonment of contracts. People weren't closing on contracts that they'd put in place for a builder to buy a house, and they secured financing on them. So the builder was, completing the construction of this home, and they would go to their final closing on their new construction. They would close out on it, but they'd been trying to list it, trying to sell it, and it wasn't selling. And so the first thing that happened to that property was the for sale sign went in the yard, right? Mm-hmm. And it just sat there because at that same time, the people who were lucky enough to have closed 3 or 4 months earlier had already had their home on the market at that same high price, but they weren't able to sell theirs, so they're dropping their price. And that guy who just added his home, well, he's dropping his price in response, and now the other guy's dropping his, and now a foreclosure happens. And when a foreclosure happens, that guy who gets foreclosed on so bitter and so angry that he goes and rips out the sink, tears off the light fixtures, pours concrete in the drain. He's totally ticked off at the whole world right now. And so he leaves a very badly damaged and abandoned home. What does that do? That becomes the most recent comp in the whole housing market. A vandalized, damaged home that goes back to the bank sells as for us, was one of the first times we had seen it, an REO, right?
Yeah.
or even the attempt at that time at short sales. They were both happening right at the same time. But that REO sets the comparable home value at this super depressed price because the home has been trashed. And it's the only home sale in the whole neighborhood.
For the sake of the listeners, what is a REO or a short sale?
Yeah, okay, so great questions, because these are big players now. An REO is short for real estate owned, right? And that is a foreclosed asset. It's something that a bank owns or a lender owns, and they foreclosed on it, and now they're going to put it on the market for sale right alongside retail properties. They're owned by, Joe mom and pop owner-occupant, right? Mm-hmm. So here's a conventional sale, and then here's an REO, a bank-owned foreclosure property. Now, right alongside that listing, there's a short sale. This is a property owned by mom and pop investor, maybe, and he just can't sell the house. So he's trying to throw it on the market and get the market to accept a lower price than what he owes on the property. And he has a mortgage, let's say, for $200,000, but he's going to try and sell it for $150,000 because he thinks that's what the house is actually worth. Because what's just sold? The REO at $150,000, which was trashed. And so the guy's now saying, my house might only be worth $150,000 now, so let me see if I can get a buyer for it, and if I can get my lender to accept $150,000. Suddenly you have a short sale. And a lot of times you can find a buyer for $150,000, and eventually the lenders see the handwriting on the wall, and they're like, we better dump this house for $150,000 and settle on the mortgage. Otherwise we're going to be left holding an REO, even more badly damaged than the first one, right? So they go ahead and they approve the short sale. And that vicious cycle of short sale and REO continues, pretty much riding the whole downward side of the housing market crash for the next 4 years.
Yeah. Yeah, so if we want to frame this with some statistics real quickly, it's very interesting. The Federal Housing Finance Agency puts out these numbers from the St. Louis Fed. If you look at home price appreciation from 1980 to 2000, it averaged 5.7% per year in the Tampa Bay area. It's just this area, not the whole country, Tampa Bay area, always been a desirable area to be, but home prices for that 20-year period averaged 5.7% per year in appreciation. If you look at the period from 2000 to the peak of the housing boom in 2006, we saw 22% per year growth in housing price. 22% per year. And so I think there were a couple functions for that, and there were a couple things that'll build the momentum a little bit on the backside that got us ramped up to hit this full steam ahead after 2000. And one thing you remember is Congress, when Bill Clinton was president, started enacting measures to make home buying more accessible for lower income families. They lowered some of the thresholds for FHA loan qualification and put in some bond money and other down payment assistance programs for lower income households. I think that may have been a very small piece of getting the ball rolling toward what would eventually become this ramp, that began in 2000 to get us up to the peak. But 22% per year from 2000 to 2006, which is very interesting because as we compare that to today, if you look at what we've seen in Tampa Bay for the last 2 years, we're averaging 26% per year. So if we want to make some comparisons to, hey, are we on the verge of a crash in a bubble? Well, if you look just at the stats, we're growing faster now than we were back then in that boom that happened in the early 2000s. Fundamentally, though, I think there's probably some key differences.
Yeah, not only are we seeing then a slightly faster growth rate, but I think we're also seeing a similar exponential growth rate in the period leading up to the peak. So we had a period of time from probably 2003 to 2005 where that run-up rate was significantly higher than that low 20s. We were looking at more like 30 to 35%. And what we're seeing right now is a period of time where our run-up rate in home prices, at least since 2020, is higher than the average has been over the last decade or so, too. So we're seeing an exponentially increased growth curve over the last few years, which might lead some people to say, yeah, we're looking like we're getting to a peak of a market or a bubble, just like we had a bubble back there. Which then we have to come back and attempt to define what a bubble is, right? So a bubble, want to take a stab chase. I looked up like 12 different definitions of bubble, and they're all like roughly the same kind of thing. But do you want to take a stab at what what is best defines that bubble, housing market bubble?
Well, to me, what it is when you see outsized growth that has no underlying foundation for it. When you can't support the growth numbers with things like population growth, things like upward mobility of families, things like wages, and things, underlying economic data that is the bedrock of why homes become more valuable.
Oh, that's good. Okay, so there are other people that will simply state it as when we have an increase in demand that is less than the increase in prices, right? So prices are growing at a faster rate than what demand is growing at. And so they'll define it as simply as that. But I think yours is more complex. There's a lot more than just those two variables that are going to say that we're in a bubble or not. There might be any number of factors that in the absence of, such as employment, such as job opportunities, such as wage growth, that if those things aren't there, then we could equally define the market as being bubbly.
Yeah, and so often, when you're talking about things like home prices and housing, a bubble becomes something more psychological than it maybe is fundamentally, actually a bubble. And I think that's why we get this question right now. That's why constantly people are posing this question. Well, wait, it feels like a bubble. Like, you can't see it. You can't put your finger on what it is. It's just this feeling. It's what you read in the papers. It's what you see on the news. It's what your perspective is maybe on what Zillow says your home is worth or what things around you are selling for. Makes you individually feel like, oh man, that's crazy. I would never pay that much for a house. Now, boom. Yeah. All of a sudden you feel like there's probably a bubble.
Right. And what do bubbles do, right? They explode, right? I mean, so that's the fear, right? Is that we're all going to be chugging along nice and steady, dealing with our 24.6% increases, and then the market blows up, right? And everyone loses all their value. And it wasn't that way in the mid-2000s. It didn't overnight blow up. I mean, it felt like it did because, we were all you're literally watching your clock, and when, why is this house not selling and my mortgage payment is coming due? But it took some years. It took years for those home prices to kind of chug along on a flat line level before they started to correct because of the REO and the short sale, tango that happened for the subsequent few years. But it didn't explode, right? And so that kind of forces us to kind of assess, are we right there? Are we at that point now where prices are run up, we're going to deal with whatever kind of run up we're looking at, but we're going to have somewhat of a flat line, and then we're going to have some kind of a price correction, a downturn, right? That will be caused by who knows what, but it's there. It's going to happen because we're in a bubble. Is that where we are?
Well, can I speak really quick to that question that keeps getting posed lately? At least we're speaking Tampa specific on this podcast, so local Tampa people are saying, we think it's a bubble, we think it's high, I want to wait before I purchase. I saw this thing on the internet recently, and I thought it was cute. I thought it was interesting. It was saying, don't ask the locals. And it was talking about sleepy little town in California perspective. It was Palo Alto back in the 80s. Average home price was maybe 50 to 100 grand. And if you came in there and you bought a house for 150 grand, 200 grand, the locals would look at you like you're crazy. They'd be like, that's way too overpriced. I would never pay that. I'm not buying that. Today, average home price is $4 million. So there is an existential shift of what the market is. Now it's the Silicon Valley. It's not a sleepy country town anymore. So having said that, what do you think about the Tampa market? Is it changing?
Is it Palo Alto?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, we could be on the verge of something similar. I mean, multiple sites right now sources are citing that not only are people moving to Florida, but companies are too. Mm-hmm. We've got a very attractive climate for people and companies. We've got a very attractive tax situation. We've got a very pro-business governor and legislature. We've got a pretty affordable cost of living compared to Silicon Valley or New York City or any of these other major metros where businesses have historically had hubs. So the environment seems to be pretty attractive for something transformative to occur. What will that be? I don't know. But right now we're seeing population boom. I mean, since COVID and even beyond COVID, I mean, we grew 14% in the last decade up until 2020, and they're projecting to grow at about a 3% per year clip for the next 4 years. So tons of people moving to this area.
Yeah, so talking about fundamentals, I mean, these stories that you guys were saying about, these empty houses, just rows and rows of empty houses, I mean, that's just not what's going on today, right?
Yeah, no, we're close. No, we're close. I mean, let's do a comparison then. Here's what's not happening today that was happening all the way back then. Homes are being purchased by owner-occupants. I think we said 70% of home sales, is it year-to-date, Chase?
Year-to-date, yep.
Are by owner-occupants. I don't have the data for what that was at the last housing market run-up, but what we know is that so much of what was being purchased was vacant. It's not the case now. We had a huge number of those being financed by these undocumented loans. That ninja loans,
yes.
The liar loans. That's not happening today. The people who are getting financing are well underwritten. They may have FHA financing, so they're not putting down a ton of cash, but they're well qualified by today's standards compared to what that was in 2005. So by those two measures alone, we're in a very different place than what we were 20 years ago. So when these homes are being bought, they're being moved into, and in a lot of cases, we have considerable amount of money being spent by both the sellers or the buyers when they buy the homes to fix up the assets. So even when we don't have, like back in the 2000s when they were buying existing homes, so often they were flipping something unimproved. They were trying to sell it without having made any additional changes to it. Now, product that's being sold often is substantially improved or renovated after sale. So big money is being put into them to improve people's equity positions. And why? Because folks have a lot of cash, right, from the bailouts that accompanied the COVID bailouts. So three very different fundamentals there. Am I missing any?
No, I mean, I think when you look at the data, where you see year over year, the average purchase price in Tampa Bay is up 22.3%. In the month of March, this is an interesting stat published by Greater Tampa Realtors. It was in the month of March, 100% of closed transactions closed at list price or higher in the month of March. There's no negotiating. The only negotiating is by the seller, right?
For more money.
Yeah, for more money,
Yeah.
right? 6 days average to contract. So within a week, everything that hits the market is spoken for in some way, shape, or form. Now, lenders are dragging their feet a little bit. They've got staffing issues, people working remote. The approval process are taking longer. It's taking longer to get a survey and appraisal. So the close dates are at 42 days, which still isn't too bad. But 6 days to contract, I think, is really what indicates how strong the market is. And we've only got 0.6 of 1 month of housing supply, so 18 days. We've got 18 days of housing stock in this area. That's it. Historically, we would see 90 to 100 days being a comfortable equilibrium. We're at 18 days. So there's a lot of reasons for that. And maybe we should speak to the supply side first and talk about some of the things we experienced during COVID, how COVID affected some of the demand on one side and also the supply on the other, and maybe it's created a little bit of a squeeze here that's resulting in some of these stats.
Yeah, I think we can even go pre-COVID, and we can say that after the housing market crash in the mid 2000s, builders, of course, many went out of business. Many of the workforce of builders moved away because there was no business to do, and we just ground on the halt of new construction starts for many years. And while the market absorbed all that product that was built speculatively through the 2000s, it did not get the right plan, get the right momentum and flywheel going for new construction demand that was coming, right? Because populations were certainly still growing, lots of migration into the Florida market, and we just didn't have development in the pipeline like we should have. And so now we're looking back and saying, we really missed it by about 10 years. We didn't have sufficient development going on for the last 10 years to meet just ordinary demand for homes that we would experience. And what we're dealing with now is not ordinary demand for homes, at least not in Florida. COVID came along. We had all kinds of blue states shut down their populations and lock them in to 150-year-old homes in freezing cold states. And a whole lot of people said, I'd rather be in Florida, right? And for lots of good reasons. They're like, let's go to a state that's open. Let's go to a state where I can spend half this much on housing, where I can actually have sunshine. And if I'm forced to work from home, I can be in a state where I can actually also go to a coffee shop, right? And so big surges of demand for movers from blue states into Florida, into the Sun Belt, Texas and Arizona included in that, and that created an abnormal surge in demand for homes.
Yeah, it really is something to think about, the dead period for new construction. I mean, I remember 2016 roughly, big builders like Lennar finally turning the spigot back on.
Right.
And building communities again. They had land banks, right? A lot of these guys went out of business. We had consolidation between like Pulte and Syntex and some of these other big conglomerate builders during that time. And they had land banks, but they were just sitting on it, doing nothing. And then about 2016, we started to see the groundbreaking again, and then putting homes up. But it was a 10-year gap from the real heavy construction until that time. And now we're seeing that lag, just augmented by COVID.
And do you remember saying to yourself when they started building again, oh, it's too soon. There's not demand for this home, right?
Yes, yeah.
I remember I felt that way. I saw all kinds of neighborhoods going up around my area, and I was like, really? Is now the time, right? But it was, because it took years for them to get permits on every one of those properties, because in the meantime, all the local municipalities had ratcheted up construction standards. They had layered on environmental standards. The construction process was becoming more difficult, and no one knew what was around the corner when it came to actual material supplies. But the whole international logistics and supply chain structure was getting ready to grind to a halt once COVID hit, and that was only 4 years away. So the builders had a little bit of time to get their legs under them, and then they had to grind to a halt once again and lock down development because we had shortages of supplies coming in from overseas and material shortages and a host of other things. So, wow. I mean, we couldn't have had a more perfect storm to constrain supply and drive up demand as what we've had over the last 10 years.
Yeah, by the time they started building again in 2016, we were still about 15% off peak prices, which is interesting. So 15% off peak prices, they saw an opportunity, because then it would take until the end of 2018 where we finally got back on par with peak prices. So it was over a decade it took this local economy to recover completely from a housing price perspective from that bust that happened in 2008.
We should have been celebrating that day.
Yeah, I know.
Why didn't we? At 290, we should have been looking back and saying that's our lost decade, right? Everyone has a lost decade, and there it was.
But meanwhile, in 2018, when housing prices got back to normal, we were 6-7 years into a bull market. Mm-hmm. The market started rallying in 2012 and, took off. Right. So economically, people were doing well, but housing still hadn't caught up until this recent explosion, fueled by several different things. When you look at supply and demand is there, people moving down from the north for sure. One interesting thing, too, is historically, people from New York and New Jersey had often gone to the East Coast. They had gone to Palm Beach, Miami area. That was like their nesting ground for retirement, right? The West Coast had historically been more people from New England had come to the West Coast. Huge concentrations of Boston Red Sox fans all up and down the west coast of Florida. But now we've got it intermingled, where we saw a huge influx of Philly, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, all those people flocking to Tampa during COVID.
My wife is one of those.
Oh, yeah? Is she from Jersey?
Jersey, yeah. Jersey girl.
Yeah. Why did you, she came for college, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Did her family come?
No, not yet.
Oh, not yet?
Not yet.
Yeah, not yet.
I mean, just talk about property taxes alone up there. But maybe for another podcast. Well, could we do something here? We're seeing, we're so many years into this bull market. What would it take for this bull market to continue? And then for the bears out there, what would it take for this to crash?
We'll be back after a quick break. You hear a lot about supply chains these days, because if the past couple years have taught us anything, it's that an efficient, well-managed supply chain is absolutely critical to keeping businesses successful and consumers happy. I'm Will Haywood, and I host a podcast called All Business, No Boundaries, where we talk about supply chains, how they work, what happens when they don't, and the innovations that are redefining what's possible in the world of logistics. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Well, I think recently, just over the past couple of weeks, we're starting to see the market, correct a little bit. And you want to blame that on different things. We had this recent war in Ukraine. We've got an oil crisis. We've got gas prices going through the roof. Take out the war with Ukraine. I don't know what dynamic we have right now. Take out COVID. I don't know what dynamic we have right now. It's hard to predict how things could have been had these major world events not occurred. And I think that's why a lot of people feel like maybe there's more uncertainty now than there normally would be, is because our situation today has been so heavily impacted by two events that kind of sprung up out of nowhere that are completely out of our control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, except when we look at the housing market trends nationally, we don't, although we have a recent peak in pricing that is greater, or a recent, I should say, run-up in pricing that's greater than what the trend has been. But the trend from 2018 to 2020 was very strong, right? That was a solid increase of roughly 20% per year from 2015 to 2018. So it's gotten better than that since then, but it was already running up very healthfully, very strongly. And and so the question you've got to ask yourself is, were we seeing an abnormal growth cycle then? And I'm not sure you were. If you just do some basic regression analysis and you look back, you try to carve off some of the peaks and the troughs of the last 30 years, what we saw from 2015 to 2018 was an ordinary growth cycle, right? Just do some straight line regression analysis. That's an ordinary growth cycle. And if you look at that over the course of time, we've suggested that's around 8% unadjusted, probably like 6% adjusted growth rates over the course of that period of time. That's what folks have said the housing market growth rate should is. So the only thing I think we have to worry about or be worried about is this most recent exponential growth rate, where that growth rate is faster than average. That's the one you want to look at and say, is that one normal? Because what we see usually is that kind of a run-up, that greater than normal run-up, accompanied by a little bit of a correction, so that then the growth rate can get back on its normalized trend again.
Yeah, so you think about this in a very basic way, maybe, is that there's got to be a ceiling for price in every market, considering the demographics of that area. People in Tampa Bay, as it sits right now, can only afford to pay so much for a house. And so if you look at what's available for sale, there's only certain people that are going to, number one, be attracted to that home and want to buy that home. And then there's going to be the issue of, well, can they actually afford to buy that home? Mm-hmm. And if they can, great. As long as they can afford it, we'll continue to see positive trends, because affordability is one of the major factors in whether or not builders can move homes, people can sell existing homes, people can upgrade their standard of living, people can buy the home they want to buy. And that may be the challenge that's kind of looming on the horizon, is affordability. If you look at, published demographic data by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, it's saying that in Tampa, the average household, or the median household income, is around $58,000 a year. I think that's a lot lower than what my, local experience would tell me. But some suggest that number's up around 80 or 90,000 for median household income, or average household income maybe is what that is. Even at that, at $90,000 a year, you're talking about a $400,000 to $450,000 home is all a person that makes that much money can afford, and that's if they don't have a lot of other debt on the books. So if they've got a $700 a month car payment, and they've got a $400 student loan payment, and they've got all this other stuff that people classically have, someone in the average state of household income is going to have a hard time affording what is now the average purchase price in this area of $475,000.
Right. And that is a dilemma for a market that is open to local people only, right? I mean, that if the local people are the buyers in that market, that's a really big dilemma for that market. That's going to make a fairly hard ceiling on prices. But what if you have an international market, right? What if you have a market that's attractive to people moving in from other places at a higher and higher rate, which I think is what we're dealing with here in Tampa. See, we're not just trying to be affordable to locals, right? We're actually trying to stay attractive to an international population. And is Tampa that? I think what we're seeing is that not only is Tampa that, but the whole United States is that for Europeans. It's still one of the most affordable international housing markets. I think it was number 1 on the affordability list that just was published. Tampa itself continues to be on one of the most affordable cities in the U.S. from a comparable standpoint. You threw out Palo Alto. There's numerous examples like that where you can't get a fraction of what you get here for double or triple the price. And so if you're looking at a relocation opportunity or a downsizing opportunity for retirees, those folks are not constrained by the same kind of income constraints as locals are. Now, of course, a market's not going to thrive fundamentally if you don't have solutions for locals. But I would say that we have a far more broad and deep buyer demand in our local market than just locals. And that's what could buoy an accelerating growth trend in prices.
Well, just with all these factors that, is all going all through the news cycles, rampant inflation and just unprecedented money printing and the possibility of, like a stock market recession on the loom. What if that did happen? What if the stock market slowed? What if job growth slowed? How much would that affect our real estate market?
Well, it definitely plays into the affordability issue.
Yeah.
That was really the catalyst of the housing crash in 2008. It wasn't necessarily that people couldn't afford the houses before the recession. It was due to the recession, people couldn't afford the houses. I mean, that's really what happened there. And typically that's what happens. Housing is a laggard. So housing will lag the condition of the economy. So if we are at the beginning of what might be a recession, some are pegging it as a short-term, downtick. Some are saying it could be a sustained but very mild recession. That will definitely impact jobs, impact people's income and their ability to afford things. But one difference is going to be that there was so much less speculation in housing to lead to this run-up. Mm-hmm. And so people aren't sitting with 2 and 3 vacant houses. They're not sitting on 2 or 3 spec contracts. They just got their home to worry about primarily. And so as long as they haven't overextended themselves in their own home situation, we might not see the drastic effects that we saw from 2008.
Yeah, I think it probably warrants some more study than we've done to determine in 2008, the short sales and the foreclosure inventory, how much of that was owner-occupied inventory? And my suspicion is it was a very low number. That most of that stuff that was being short sold and foreclosed on and taken back by banks was speculated inventory, entirely investor-driven and unoccupied. And so it's a whole different thing when you're foreclosing on your wife and children's house, right? Mm-hmm. Than it was you're foreclosing on a home that you bought for some nameless, faceless family, right? And so here's where we are today. Are people going to be as were people be as negligent in their underwriting and their purchasing of their primary residence as they were of their investment properties back in the 2000s? I don't think so. And so even if we do fall on hard times, do we see anywhere close to the foreclosure rate? I don't think we do, right? So that means this, right? We don't see surges in supply at low prices. And if we don't all of a sudden see a bunch of homes come on the market at low prices, then there's nothing to pull the home prices down. Maybe we see a surge in supply, but they come on the market at market prices. They come like flatline. So the market hangs out for a while. Maybe a while is a few years, or we don't experience home price growth. But unless we have distressed sales really pulling it down, or urgencies forcing people to sell for lower prices, that product just sits on the market and languishes, right? While eventually it's absorbed by buyer demand. Because there is buyer demand. There are people still moving to the U.S. There are people still moving in droves to Florida. They have to have somewhere to live. So unless they're pitching tents, they're going to buy houses. And they're going to probably cash out some stocks and some equities to do that, and maybe those have depreciated in value due to a recession somewhat, but what choice do they have, right? Housing is a fundamental need. They've got to do that first before anything else. So they cash out their already declined value in bonds. They buy that house that they know they need to buy, and they just hold their nose and do it because they need a place to live, and living in Florida is still cheaper than living in New York or Boston. So it goes on.
Well, so could we do like a blue sky picture then? Just like you said, the demand doesn't go away. People continue to want to live in Florida. Even people in Florida are migrating, right, from South Florida over here because, the median price down there is $450. We're $350 currently. So people keep moving in. The pressure on the home prices keeps raising. And then let's just say, blue sky analysis, the supply chain catches up and we're able to build again and meet the demand. What would happen to our real estate market?
Well, if I understand what you're asking, it historically has. And when you look at factors influencing demand right now, we're in an environment where we've got rising interest rates. That plays on the psyche. We've got an atmosphere where prices are high for locals, as we talked about earlier, higher than they think maybe they should be. And so we've got a psychological bubble in the minds of some people. We've got the wind down of, there's several commentators recently talking about this idea of FOMO when it comes to housing. It's like, I better buy this house now because I might not find another house that I can buy. And so they've been jumping on these houses and even willing to offer well over asking price in order to get a house just out of fear. Mm-hmm. All of these things, fear, anxiety, the psychology impacts that all go into how people spend money and make major purchase decisions in their lives, wear people out. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see somewhat of a leveling off of demand. And we're still going to have the population growth coming in, but from people that already live here, in terms of upgrading or reloading, it wouldn't surprise me if we start to see that demand table off a little bit. And demand continue to be fueled by external relocators from the north and other places coming to Florida. The population is projected to grow at 3% a year for the next 4 years. That's going to be 42,000 people a year coming to this MSA. That's a lot of demand, right there. On the supply side, I think we are going to see supply open up. There's already evidence to suggest that lumber prices are back on their way down slightly. I think they're probably about 10% off their peaks at this point. I know I went to buy a fence panel the other day at Home Depot. It was $82. Yesterday it was $76. So almost 10%.
There you go.
Right?
Softening prices. Right?
Lumber's coming down. Will the truss plants pick up, so that they can shrink their lead time for orders? Some of these factors are still kind of yet to be known, but they will catch up at some point. Windows and doors seem to be the thing that builders are waiting on right now but we do make a lot of that stuff here in the U.S. and in South America. We're not relying upon China for that. We're not putting semiconductors into these homes. So there are ways we can continue to try and solve the supply issue. Once supply loosens up, and I think demand starts to table off a little bit, we will get into a point where pricing will come back more into equilibrium, I guess you might say, with demand and supply doing those things. Will we continue to see 20, 25, 30% increases in price over the next few years? My personal opinion is that's going to table off because of those factors I just described. That kind of growth cannot be driven entirely by just population growth. And we won't have another pandemic to accelerate that growth. And we won't have any other, economic stimulus on the horizon that I think is going to be a catalyst to shoot that as high as it has been over the past 2 years.
So you think it's going to plateau a little bit, but then steadily grow?
I think that would be my prognostication or crystal ball for the market in this area.
So I guess optimistically, like you said, everything plays out. Like Tampa in 10 years, what is it looking like? Real healthy?
I would say so. I mean, I think we see the 3 to 4 or 5%, average growth rate over the next 10 years.
Well, so that is the worst case scenario we've seen over the last 30 years, right? It's a 3% increase per year, right? And the best side of that, it's been like a 7% increase per year. And if your home increases at 3% per year over a 10-year period, it will grow by a rate of about 50% in value. So your home is a $500,000 home. In 10 years, it will be a $750,000 home, right? If it grows at a 7% rate, like we've seen over the last decade, if your home is a $500,000 home now, it'll be a $1 million home 10 years from now. That's kind of what we're looking at in hard numbers, and that's with some. I mean, like if I'm looking at 2010 to 2020 growth, I'm not including pandemic growth surges or Ukraine growth surges in that growth rate. I'm saying that was what it was like, really, kind of from the start of the crash till 2020. So let's assume then that that's just kind of the normal growth rate that Tampa was dealing with, and that what we're now having is a new normal of attractiveness for Tampa Bay, growth for remote work, and just it's Tampa's time. It's Tampa's Palo Alto moment. Then I think what we're looking at is at least what we're talking about here, and we can very reasonably think that it's going to be somewhere in excess of these amounts, which makes Tampa an extremely attractive investment opportunity. If you can make more than 7% per year on your investment with a fixed asset, with the limited risk that comes from a fixed asset, then now is absolutely the time to invest in Tampa real estate. And I think that's the takeaway I hope that everyone hears. Things aren't normal in Tampa right now, and they're probably not going to be for a long time, because Tampa is by no means a normal U.S. city. It's a prime U.S. city. People are only now starting to realize that. So, come along.
Yeah, well, when people talk about Florida, I think they always talk about Miami, right? They always talk about Orlando. You think it's going to be number 3, Tampa?
I do.
We have a baseball team. We got a really good hockey team. We got champions, we got Brady signing back on.
Tampa Bay, man. Tampa Bay. What does Orlando have? The Magic haven't won anything in decades.
I just wish we had basketball.
I got the mouse. It would be nice to have a basketball team. Right. That would round it out nicely. They need to share the magic. Yeah, right.
Because what makes a top tier team, to the average person, right? They need the sports.
It does.
Well, there's one thing Orlando doesn't have, and if you live in Orlando, you've got a 2-hour drive to the water in traffic. Mm-hmm. We've got some of the most beautiful water anywhere to be found. For anyone who lives in the Midwest, you live in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Nebraska. You come down here and you fly into Tampa Airport, and then they take you over what I call the Chamber of Commerce Bridge to merge onto the interstate, where you get up to about 40 feet in the air, and all you see is turquoise water and white sand with $1 million homes lining the bay. I mean, that was genius, whoever did that, by the way. Yeah, Thank you, nice. FDOT, for putting that in place. I mean, you got to look at that and think, man, this is paradise. And I think that's what a lot of people are saying, and that's why they're coming.
Yeah. And 3 months out of the year, I mean, it's just heaven on earth.
And the key, though, I do want to emphasize this, because I do think the key is, one thing Orlando has outpaced us in here is job growth, high-tech job growth, high-paying job growth. We have not seen a real, splurge of high-paying job growth here in Tampa yet. Everyone says we're on the cusp of it, that it's coming, but it hasn't come yet. It will have to come for us to continue to be this hub of great living, affordable living, wonderful housing market to invest in, and all the other attractive things that the state of Florida and this MSA have to offer.
This might be another podcast, but yeah, I mean, what do we have currently? I think we have really strong healthcare, right? What else does Tampa have going for it?
On an industry basis?
Yeah,
it does. It lacks, it's always been kind of a blue-collar services economy. Call centers have thrived in Tampa, right? And only, I think, in the work-from-home environment have we seen the kind of growth in professional jobs that would buttress the kind of growth in home values that we've seen over the last little while. So maybe the new economy can allow that maybe the new economy can grow on that kind of reality, on the shoulders of work from home and increased mobility. But I don't think so. I think it's going to need some real big corporate citizens to join it in order to make it work. I'm with Chase on that one. So, but we're going to see them. I think we have enough incentives and enough of just general quality of life down here in the Bay Area, Tampa Bay area, that we will see that happening over the next 10 years. It will be part of the growth rate to justify what we've seen.
Yeah, we've got one of the fastest growing and largest public universities, not only in the state of Florida, but in the Southeast and the University of South Florida. And that so far has been a huge factor in attracting some of these high-tech jobs. And I think it's going to continue to do that for us. We're starting to make big strides in cybersecurity, even in crypto and some other areas like that because of the university and the attractiveness of programs that they're running through there. And so lots of good stuff going for us here in Tampa Bay. For those of you out there looking for a place to invest your money, no better place than Tampa Bay.
Well, I guess that's the podcast. All right. Well, keep going on that too, though. Orlando, they have a lot of hospitality, right? I mean, the Magic Kingdom and all that. I'm surprised. Why don't we have more of that here? Like you said, with the beaches and all.
We do. It's just all on Pinellas beaches. I mean, and one interesting thing is government intervention over the years has done a good thing in keeping those beaches very residential feeling for the most part, except for Clearwater. But that's